Okay, so we're getting down to the end. So homework 5 is due today. Hopefully everybody got it in. Homework 6 is up, and it's pretty straightforward. The TAs, hopefully by tomorrow at noon-ish, will take everybody's comments and distribute it back to the people who did it. And the homework is basically, if you remember the yellow column, it's to fill in the yellow column based on your responses to what people said, and to then update your design based on people's comments. One of the questions people always have is that the comments people make may not be something you approve of or agree with. Obviously, the reviewers are people like you, so they're not necessarily experts either. And everybody had to find, whatever it is, 6 problems. So they might have kind of scraped the bottom of the barrel in terms of finding something to talk about if you have a really good interface. So it's perfectly reasonable to say you don't want to do the change that people recommend. But then you have to say why not, right? You can say, they recommended I change the page from green to blue, and I don't want to do that because blue is our theme color. Or they recommended changing this, but that would make it inconsistent with this other page. If the TAs don't agree with your motivation, though, then you'll lose points, right? If you don't have any good reason why not to make the change, something's done incorrectly and you don't want to change it, then that's really not appropriate. Oh, the other category is things that weren't supposed to be implemented, in spite of the fact that we tell people over and over again that doesn't really count. People continue to say this button doesn't work, or there's no checking on the data, correctness. And for those kinds of recommendations, it's perfectly fine to say, this would certainly be fixed in the final version, but this is just a prototype, and so there's no need for that particular feature to work yet. So that's another reasonable response. So that's basically the idea. It's designed to be a somewhat easier assignment since it is the last week, and it's also only worth 10 points instead of 12 or 13. Even though this is the last week of class for main campus, because we started a week late on the TEPR schedule, we have 2 classes next week during what is normally exam period. And then the exam is actually next Thursday. So the information about the exam is up on the webpage. Just as a quick summary, the exam's offered twice, once on Thursday morning and once on Monday. And anyone can come to either session. We have great big rooms both times. So it seems to work out pretty well. The people split pretty evenly. About half come early and half come late. And it all depends on your schedule, which one you prefer. On Wednesday, it's course evaluation day. And so I'm asked by the university to give everybody a few minutes at the beginning of class, let's say 5 minutes, for you to fill out all the course evaluations. So you should probably bring a laptop to do that. We have 2 evaluations. There's the official university one, which is kind of annoying and not particularly helpful. So I've made up my own evaluation, which is much more specific to the contents of the course. And I do significantly change the course every year based on people's comments. So I really would appreciate any kind of feedback you have about how to improve the course, topics to remove or add, ways of making the homeworks more valuable, whatever you would like to comment on. It's entirely anonymous. It uses SurveyMonkey, and I really do change the course every year, so I would appreciate your feedback. Any logistics questions? Okay. So today's topic is about the web, and specifically designing for the web. And I just wanted to mention that in terms of designing for the web and designing for mobile, which is Wednesday's lecture, that you'll see that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is from this weekly newsletter that the Nielsen Norman Group sends out called Alertbox. And he's been doing it for many years. Jakob Nielsen's one of the real originators of usability engineering and lots of the mechanisms and techniques that we use. He's coined the 10 heuristic analysis guidelines that we use. So he's has a lot of great data, and he has a nice group of people working with him. He used to personally write these Alertbox messages, but now he has his staff do it, and they're still really good. And one of the neat things about them is they're not generally just his opinions, that they're based on actual studies that they do, and they're continually running studies of websites and mobile devices and stuff like that. And so I really find it very interesting. They're almost always quite relevant. It's typically 1 or 2 articles, and you can sign up here if you're interested. So today we're going to focus on desktop web because most of the issues about mobile devices we're going to cover on Wednesday when we talk about mobile user interfaces in general. Obviously, an increasing share of web browsing is on mobile devices, and most of the design ideas here would apply perfectly well to tablets. It's mainly an issue of screen size in terms of the mobile device. And this only goes to 2014. We had a visitor last week from Yahoo who was telling us how the curve is really taking an inflection point and going up much more dramatically in favor of mobile browsing. So websites are pretty much a requirement for every country, every company, anywhere in the world. And that the usability of websites for companies, people are paying a lot more attention to it, but it's still pretty bad in the sense that if you check out people's success at a whole bunch of different kind of tasks, and you remember last time we talked about tasks. So even if you're not selling something on the web, if you're a car manufacturer or you're a Giant Eagle, or there are lots of companies that don't sell anything on the web. They still have to have websites, and the tasks are things like finding out the store hours or finding out the properties of the particular products or getting the user's manual if you have some kind of technology. And measuring across all these kinds of tasks, people are still abysmally successful. So it went up from 22% to 40% of success at doing all of these different kinds of tasks with websites. And even if you have an e-commerce site, a substantial number of people are there not to buy something but to do research, right? How many people go to Amazon just to understand the properties of an application or a device before they go ahead and buy it at Best Buy, or they'll just do research for a while and then eventually buy something. That's why the emails from Expedia and TripAdvisor are so annoying. It's like, you forgot to do your travel. It's like, no, I was doing research. I didn't really intend to do purchasing at that point. Obviously shopping is important, but learning is even more important. And to the extent that your website helps people learn, then people will be more, they'll think nicer about your website. They'll be more likely to come back when they are ready to buy something. So you should make sure that people find your website attractive and useful. So this is kind of the same information that was on the second slide about failure rates and things that people are trying to do. They end up having problems with. Issue? People who study these kinds of activities, and they all pretty much are consistent, that there's an enormous failure rate. This is some slightly newer data that talks about the implications of a bad website on people's brand identity. So companies always want people to think nicely about them, right? So think that they're a high quality company, to think that they are consumer friendly. And it turns out that a lot of these attitudes can be significantly impacted by the quality of the website, especially in a negative way. So if people go to your website and try to understand something, or try to find out details about your products, or try to find information about your company, and if they if they fail at their tasks, or if they find problems with your website, missing links, bad color choices, bad design, then, when it takes too long to load because servers are overloaded or whatever. So they did a survey, and that 28% said they'd go to a competitor's website instead, 27% would not visit the website, 18% said they wouldn't visit again, and 13% would think that maybe there's been some sort of malicious attack on the website or something. So the moral is that no matter what you're selling, your company's website has to be really high quality. And as we also talked about before, that applies whether you're a big company or a little company. That one of the things people often do with their websites is kind of hide how big the company is. But just because you're a little company doesn't mean that people are going to not necessarily expect you to have a high quality website. Many companies now have moved a lot of their internal processes and internal forms onto the web, and it's all called an intranet. So it's internal to the company. So when you want to fill out a travel request, or if you're looking up your pay scale, if you're looking up how many vacation days you have left, or you're trying to find out any kind of policy of the company, or it might be directly work-related if you're trying to document something or find out something about your products. The success rate has been fairly flat over a long period of time, and it's still only 75%. So it means a quarter of people are trying to do these tasks for themselves and failing. As a result, they have to waste a lot of time trying to figure it out. They have to bother other people. There's an enormous productivity loss as a result. So it's improved dramatically, but it's still there's still a long way to go. And also, you can much more easily calculate the expense of these bad websites for your company, because to the extent that people are wasting a lot of time, they are ending up costing money that they should be spending actually doing product-related kind of activities instead. So in this estimate, $4 million per year could be saved from going from bad usability to average usability. So that's not even spending a lot of time fixing things up, but just going from pretty bad to average. I don't know how many of you are dealing with CMU's internal websites. We moved the IRB process to something called Sparks. Also, the conflict of interest are on the same site, and everybody's productivity went way down. We used to have paper forms. Well, they were done in Microsoft Word. Since they've gone to that system, the processing time for IRBs has gone way up. It's almost double the amount of time, because the online version is worse for Warner Hall people, and it's also worse for the faculty and students as we try and write them, because the forms are complicated. It's much harder to share and copy and paste, and all sorts of other problems. And similarly, Workday, if anybody's working for CMU, that's made things a lot harder for almost everybody. So there are a lot of these situations where, in order to try and follow regulations, or in hopes of automating some processes, it actually hurts the productivity. Another way of thinking about it is that most of the activities that people are doing on the web actually require multiple steps. And you end up losing some fraction of your people at every step, right? And so in this particular formulation, you start with the home page, and then you try to find some particular product, and you lose about 9% of people who don't even make it to that step. Then you find a list of the products, and then you find a particular product, and then you try and check out, and then you finally get to the final confirmation button. And so in this particular study, only 34% of people were able to succeed all the way through. But to the extent that you can make any page more successful, then you will try to avoid losing those people. Question?
I just had a question about, you mentioned some examples where productivity went way down. Obviously, when you implement a new system, there is going to be an increase in productivity. Did you look at the long-term effects and see if productivity went above, or did it plateau out some?
Yeah, so the question is, what about the long-term effects of automating these processes with these systems? And I certainly don't have any data on that. The administration knew at CMU that both of these processes were going to have these kind of impacts. The hope was it was going to more differentially impact Warner Hall than faculty and students in general. That turned out not to be the case. The problem is that there are increasing numbers of federal regulations on universities as well as companies, that there's more and more requirements to have some of this information collected in a central place. And so they really didn't have a choice about whether to do it or not. But given that they didn't have a choice, they still could have done it in a better way than a worse way. So that's kind of the trade-off. And you see these kind of things in hospitals with electronic medical records, and there's lots of situations. The companies have increased some of the new financial laws and so forth, where more and more information has to be tracked and in case the government ever wants to audit, SEC wants to audit companies and things like that. So a lot of times you don't have a lot of choice about whether to automate some of these or whether to start collecting this information. And the issue is, to try and do it in the most effective way. Okay, so the rest of the lecture are more guidelines. So we have the 10 guidelines from heuristic analysis, which are obviously the key, most important ones that are the most general. And but there are lots of very specific guidelines for the web. And this lecture will help understand why a lot of web pages are designed the way they are, or different kinds of choices that you can make when you're doing your own web page designs. So first, most important is navigation. Almost every website is more than one page. I've never actually seen a useful website that's only a single page. So navigation is a key requirement for every website. One of the key requirements that we actually talked about in heuristic analysis was knowing where you are. Lots of different ways so that when you walk up to a page, or if you navigate directly to a page from a bookmark or from a friend's email, or if you leave your computer and come back, you need to know exactly where you are. And so there's lots of ways to achieve that. Most websites will have a very standard structure so that no matter what page you go to, it looks the same, and it's always possible to get back to the home page. So this kind of standard structure throughout the website helps you know where to look, to know which page you're on, and so forth. Another key thing that you want to know is, where have I been on this website, or how do I get back to where I was? How do I go back a step? And obviously using the back button, letting people use the back buttons is important. There's a few tricks with the back button. Obviously, if you have some sort of database that's or JavaScript code that's helping the user along or monitoring the user's page, then you have to write the script carefully so that if people go back and forwards, it still works. Another issue is avoiding forwarding links, because if you have a forwarding link, then both of those end up in your history. And so if you go back, you immediately go forwards again, which most users find very confusing. Another good technique are called breadcrumbs. And you've probably seen these where they show you kind of the hierarchy. It's not actually where you've been. It's more like the depth in the hierarchy in terms of product pages and so forth. So in this particular example, software was the top category and children was a subcategory. So directory, computers and internet, software, children. So this is, and it also notice that all pages that aren't the current page, have these links, so that means you can go up to the parent group. It's very common structure. Let's see, here's another example. So the Nielsen-Norman group does the same thing. We have different levels. Oh, and this particular one talks about why it's important and where to go to see it. Another way that you often will show the structure, of course, is by highlighting where you are. And so this one is a little subtle, but small businesses in green and payments and processing is in green. And that's how this site is trying to show you where you are in the hierarchy. I think it's a little too subtle. It would be probably better if those tabs looked more different than the other ones. We also saw that in lots of other websites that where you can tell where you've been. Another way that you used to be able to tell where you've been is by link coloring. It's pretty much gone completely from most modern websites. But in the old days, where links were just regular old HTML hrefs, then there would be two colors, one for links you visited and one for links you haven't visited, which most users found pretty useful. Nowadays, since most links are done with JavaScript and other mechanisms or with pictures, you don't get any indication of where you've been, which is a shame. So in addition to where you've been, users really need to know where they're going to go or where they can go. And that's about having links. And again, it used to be really easy to tell which were links because they were all underlined. Nowadays, that's kind of disappeared. And there's more and more issues about not being able to tell at all what are links. And so flat design is this idea that kind of everything is grays and blacks and low contrast. Makes things hard to read. Also makes it hard to tell what you can click on. So this is actually an example that this article uses. So how many people think that women and men are something you can think of just by looking at this page, something you can click on? Right? So they're circles, so you've got a really good what's called affordance or signal that that's something you can click on, and you probably get sunglasses that have to do with men and women. How many people think that gender is something you can click on? How many people think it's not something you can click on? How many people think you can't really tell by looking, right? So it turns out this is not something you can click on, but it's actually bolder than the things you can click on. And normally bold or dark things would be highlighted as a place you can click. How many people think search is something you can click on? Right? It looks exactly the same as gender. It's the same color, same thickness, right? Obviously, you can click on this icon to search, and if you click here, it turns into a text field like you'd expect. How many people think Sunglass Hut is something you can click on? It isn't, right? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Really, how about free 2-day shipping on all orders? Can you click on that? Okay. free gift card. Right? I mean, there's all sorts of things on this page. Maybe it's clickable, maybe it's not. You can't really tell by looking anymore. Right? So you have to move your mouse around and hope that the little cursor will change to a pointy finger so you can tell where you can click. And so there's lots of evidence that kind of these more designy pages have sacrificed usability in favor of design. And so just like usability engineers have to rein in software engineers to make sure that software engineers focus on usability first, to some extent, usability people have to rein in graphic designers as well, right? Because often a graphic designer will say, oh, it's so much prettier if we make everything white and light gray on white. And it's like, yeah, but then nobody can read it, right? And so obviously beauty is important and attractiveness. You certainly don't want to go all the way to the other end and get ugliness, right? But again, you have to moderate beauty by making things more usable. Having a standard navigation technique is good. Remember, consistency, showing the user where they can click, having good navigation obviously is clear. Using pop-ups is kind of, used to be really popular, now is much more muted, and that's because people don't like pop-ups, and often they're pop-up blockers, things like that can be a problem. It's also important for links to have meaningful labels, and I will go into that later. So if you remember, we talked about grouping and the site structure. So given that you have lots of stuff on your website, either lots of products or lots of different pages, some people will be able to jump directly to where they want to go using search mechanisms. But many people will try to navigate using the structure of the website. And so Nielsen did one study where he showed that there was a really incredibly dramatic difference between similar websites in terms of how well they worked for people trying to navigate to particular kinds of content. And so 80% down to 9%, right? So nobody wants to be at 9%. How do you organize your content so that people can find things? And there's a variety of user-centered techniques that we'll talk about next week that will help you let people, to help you test. Obviously, you can do a regular user study like we've done in this course, where you can let people try to find things and see if they're successful or not, which is what was done here. And there's another technique called card sorting, where you write all of the topics down on cards, and you give them to a variety of people and try and get them to organize them, and then you get a better sense of how people are thinking about your topics. Question?
How is the site for this class designed?
So, why, do you have complaints about it?
I love it.
Okay.
It's the best one I've ever had for any class, seriously.
Thanks. I was a little worried. So every few years, I've had it redesigned, and actually, if you just adjust this number, you can go back like 10 years and see all the different sites we've had. I think it was last year, the TAs, I asked the TAs as part of their role to redesign the website. And so it was done by these guys, Michael and Julie. Yeah, that was last year. They were last year's. And whoops, pending delete. That's always annoying. So I put this banner here so nobody will get confused. But so the difference is that I always had it color coded. So the older, so they were the TAs last year. And before we had a much more colorful design, but of course all designs now have to go to white and have this nice flat design. So this was no longer in style anymore. And this one was designed by a TA from a few years before that. So the simple answer is a TA did it. The more interesting answer is that through 10 years of teaching this course, I know what sort of things people keep wanting to know and what information is important to get out and what needs to be prominent and less prominent. And so we have done this iterative design, and when I talked to the TAs about what to include, we talked about the structure, the key things that people want to do right away, the information that needs to be above the fold and that people are happy to go look for. I also wanted to make it easy for me personally to modify, which is somewhat low actually in terms of how the design works. There's an awful lot of JavaScript that's magically does things, especially the homework pages. To make these work, and you notice the URL doesn't change, and so that's a little bit awkward in terms of letting me actually modify stuff. The people who come out of our program are pretty good usability people and pretty good designers as well. And so the general design and the look was all there come up with, but what's called the information architecture, which is how the information is organized and the navigation and so forth, that's come from lots of iterations. But if anybody has any recommendations, like I said, next year's site will be designed, in 9 months or whatever, and we're happy to have feedback. The important point was that you kind of need to know what people are going to call things in terms of categories, how people want to organize stuff, and then you can make a navigation system that matches what they're thinking. And sometimes it's shallow and sometimes it's deep. And so the difference is if you have 100 items or 1,000 items in your catalog, what categories are people going to think of? Are they going to think of them, with lots of depth, or is there pretty much just one level and then there'll be lots of levels? So Amazon, has 30 or 40 different choices at the top level, and then a very flat collection of things underneath it. Whereas some other stores, like drugstores and travel sites will have a much deeper hierarchy because people know I want to go on a cruise, or I want to go on an airplane, or I want to go on a train, I need to rent a car, right? And so you may have a smaller number of categories and then more subcategories. And you can't actually pick one versus the other a priori, just like most other questions in user interfaces. The answer is almost always it depends. And it depends on how people are thinking about the tasks and what their natural structure is. For product lists, the comparison feature is something that everybody likes. So CDW actually has that built in. And so if you go and pick something like printers, then you can pick, so here's an example where there are different layers of products. So now I get laser printers, and then down here in this list, I can pick two and compare them. And then it turns out, even if they're from completely different manufacturers, because there's some very standard categories of information, it can line them up and let you compare all sorts of features, right? And so this works really well in any case where you can make the products have features by categories, and then you can let people compare them side by side. And sometimes, things that aren't this kind of product will let you do that, like cruises or doctors, or lots of different kind of situations where people are going to want information about different versions or different products. In the prototypes, we told you guys to have a under construction page. That's just because it was a prototype. On the real web, you should never do that. Just make sure the links aren't there until you're ready to have them do something useful, right? Because everything on the web is always changing, and there's no real reason to expose the fact that you're not finished with this part of the website. So you can't get away from the fact that people are going to use a lot of different browsers to look at your stuff. And the World Wide Web means that you can't say, oh, well, we only really care about Macintosh people. Even if you're Apple, they have their websites work perfectly well under Internet Explorer and a variety of other browsers. There's a lot you can't control about what browsers are going to do. There are all sorts of window sizes, all sorts of different configurations, different plugins. People, different natural languages are going to try to use your website. They'll use it on different window sizes. And of course, a lot of people will go to your website on mobile devices. So you need to figure out all those. Another thing you can't control is people's navigation. So people are going to try to make a bookmark for the middle of your website. They're going to email URLs from your website to their friend, family. They're going to use Google search or whatever, which is going to find pages on the interior of your website. And so you have to design your entire website assuming that people can start at any individual page, which means that navigating out has to be just as easy as navigating in. Right? And so if they're on some product page and they got there in some mysterious way, it should be really obvious what the company is, where they are, and how to get back up to the top level if they want to do that. So these days, the most popular browsers are probably Chrome, Safari, IE, and Firefox. And so you need to make sure that your product works well on those. And unfortunately, you also have to test it on old versions. So I work a lot with lawyers, and it's amazing how restricted many companies are in terms of letting people update. And so often I'm collaborating with people who are still running 2 or 3 versions old software, and they're not allowed to update it themselves. And so even if your customer wants to run a newer version of the browser, then they might not be allowed to, right? So saying, oh, I'm sorry, my product, you can't find out anything about my product because you're running an old version of the browser, please update. You're really basically insulting a bunch of people who are going to say, yes, I'd love to, but I'm not allowed to. So you need to make sure that your system runs on 2 or 3 versions ago. So next lecture, we'll talk a lot about responsive design. It's the current buzzword for web design. And basically what it means is instead of designing a version of your website for a phone and a tablet and a laptop and a big screen, you design it once, but you make the code of your website adapt appropriately to different sizes. So one way to do that, which doesn't work very well, is just to say, I'm going to use this one design on all devices. But a more popular way, which more fits better with the definition of responsive, is that the site itself adapts. And so it has different versions in the same HTML file that it tests to see how big the window is and does something different based on different window sizes. And it turns out that this website that the students designed for us actually is a responsive design. So if we go to the main page and I start making it narrower, then at some point the little sidebar here disappears and actually jumps down to the bottom, right? Because basically there's a conditional in the HTML that says if the window is wider than some number of pixels, then leave it here, otherwise move it down to the bottom. And so that's a fairly straightforward way of making sites adapt. There's also this menu up here, and that's also adaptive. So if I get smaller than the size, then it adds the, which is sometimes called the hamburger icon. It's well understood to be a menu icon. And all of those things that are normally there all the time are moved into this sidebar that pops up and has this real prominent X to go away. And so as I get smaller and smaller, it still continues to work. And then this is the minimum size. And so if it's smaller than this, then you get a horizontal scroll bar. But this size, if you use it on an iPhone or any, is designed to be wide enough to fit on most of the common phones. So that's an example, pretty straightforward example. And you'll see lots of websites, it's kind of fun to do that, where if you just take the window and squish it, you can see how it rearranges all the pages. Another thing that changes a lot with different screens is the resolution, which is different than the size. So the resolution is the number of dots per inch. Okay, so a regular paper is about 4,000 dots per inch. And if you go to any of the movie theaters now, they say digital 4K, which means actually 4,000 pixels across. It doesn't mean 4,000 pixels per inch, which would be ridiculous. But 1080p is 1,086 pixels across, independent of how big your TV is. So obviously, if you have a really big TV, then the pixels are bigger. And actually, if you walk up here, you can actually see the pixels on this projector, because this is only 1024 pixels across, right? And so the number of pixels, if that projector was further back or the screen was bigger, then the resolution is going to be different. So the Retina display on an iPhone actually meant that they doubled the number of pixels in the same physical size. So, or maybe it was quadrupled.
I remember you don't see it as much now, but back in the day there was like 720 and 1080p high versus peak, and I wasn't sure what that meant. If it's like horizontal versus vertical.
I don't actually know. It can't be horizontal versus vertical because all TVs are horizontal, right? So it's 10. The standard is that there's 1080 pixels across, right? And the idea with HTV, if you go to a movie theater, they're really wide. So the question is, what's the ratio? And so this projector is pretty old, and this screen is designed for a slightly more square pixels, which is 728 by 1024. So it's that ratio. And HD TV, of course, is wider. So it has a different ratio of number across to the number down. And of course, a movie theater is even wider compared to the height, right? And so that's kind of the difference in the resolution and the number of pixels. So what's the deal about a bigger number of pixels? If you make your website based on pixel counts, or you make icons that are low resolution, they'll look really awful, right? And so you have to make high resolution versions of your pictures. You have to take into account, and you have to design your web pages based on what point sizes, which are measured versus, like a 10-point font is a point is some percent of an inch. And so when you try to use a 10-point font on an iPhone or Android phone or on a regular screen, it'll be about the same size because it's measured in inches rather than in pixels. So it's important to keep your resolution in mind. So this is an example of a site that doesn't do that very well. So the Tribune is a newspaper here, and if we make it narrower, eventually it just says, I don't care, I'm just going to stick with this size, right? And so then you have to do horizontal scrolling, which is well understood to be much worse than vertical scrolling. So you really prefer users not having to do horizontal scrolling to get to parts of your web page, as opposed to most of the other sites that we looked at today, which, as you make them narrower, will figure out ways of reorganizing things so that you don't have to horizontally scroll. Another issue is text in pictures. And this is really popular, especially with conferences. Everybody has a logo, right? And the problem is that there's a lot of information in this picture, right? And so they designed it in Photoshop or something. They put in all these fonts and pictures, and then they exported it as one big picture. And the problem is, there are lots of problems. One is, there's no way to select this text. So if I wanted to copy and paste this into my calendar, there is no way to get May 20th out of this, because it's just part of an image, right? And blind people won't be able to get anything out of this image except what's in the pop-up, which is not the full information, right? So the dates of the conference are only in the picture. They're not in the help text, and they're surprisingly not in this main body either, which is, so this, typically browsers will pop up the alt text for pictures, and so you need to put the information in there. Did you have a question?
Yeah, what if you had an image and I guess you did optical image or optical character recognition? Would that be a compromise or just go straight to text?
No, I mean, there are better ways of doing it. So this one, this looks like an image, but it turns out they've just put text in the right place. Stop that. Some of this. I think this. Anyway, maybe not. But when I tried before, there was something here that you could select. Anyway, you can put text in the images. You should make the alt text be the full information. Or the other thing that's a good idea is if you're going to have an image with information in it, then put the same information in the text directly below it, right? So this is part of this redundancy idea that we talked about before for people who are colorblind, whatever, that, it's a good idea for all the important information that you put it in plain text so that people have a way of copying and pasting it, people can read it, and then screen readers and other information. Also, another issue, of course, with text and pictures is Google can't index it, right? And so if you're going to search for conferences in September, Google could theoretically find this one because it can read this text, whereas it won't be able to read it if it's only in the picture. So there are lots of good reasons to be careful about putting text in pictures. On the other hand, sometimes you just want to have your logo there, right? And so there's no way Coca-Cola is going to be ever written anyway besides that, right? And that's not a font. It's actually carefully designed. And so that's clearly going to be, always be a picture. So that's, makes a lot of sense as a way of showing things. If you're doing HTML development, there's a bunch more rules about how the code for your pages should look. One is to make sure you use the semantic tags like heading 3, instead of trying to simulate it using span or using the actual font sizes. And there have been a lot of HTML tags that have been deprecated that you're not supposed to use anymore. Things like blink and big and strike and even things like italic, you're not supposed to use anymore. Instead, you have to use span and class and other kinds of HTML5 things. It turns out that there's a variety of ways of helping you achieve all these goals. There's this amazing site called Browser Shots that a student in a previous class found, which will try your website out in an amazing number of browsers. And so these The check marks are the default browsers it's going to check your site in. And this is just an example of what it comes back with for the class website. You're supposed to pay money if you use that site more than once. But if you buy a product like Dreamweaver, then it also has techniques to help you do this. You can even see them side by side while you're doing design, so that you can check and make sure that your website looks okay. So the number one complaint people typically have about websites is that they're too slow to download. And unfortunately, we made that mistake in the HCI when we redesigned our website. Now almost everything you do in our website is really slow. And we keep complaining about that, but see, here it is failing to load. Okay, finally it loaded. Now if I click on something like people, everything's really slow. Faculty? Could walk across the room and back before it'll answer, right? And I don't know if I've clicked or I missed, right? I guess I'll assume I missed. Oh, no, I didn't miss, right? So that was ridiculously slow. And so, when websites are too slow, people will figure something's broken, that they'll click again, which even more confuses things. So there's lots of issues with that. Another big issue, which they finally fixed in our site, is this incremental loading idea, like you get in Facebook, where if you scroll down, then you get some more stuff. Right? Originally, they had that for people. I think we still have that for something like news, which makes more sense. Let's see. I don't know if we're still using that mechanism, but yeah. So it's going to load more news now, and so it's got this incremental technique like Facebook. It turns out that that's a really bad idea for things that you want indexed. So originally they did that for people, and so when you tried to do a Google search for the faculty in the HCI, you only got the faculty with A's and B's. Because Google doesn't try to scroll down and see if it gets more pages, right? It's just going to take the first page and index that. And so the only people who are indexed were the people who are at the top of the alphabet. So those of us at the end of the alphabet were really pissed. And we told them they had to change this page from an incremental loading to a regular one. Also, you can't do a search on page. So I was actually just dealing with this with LinkedIn. I don't know if any of you already noticed, but they changed the connection list to be one of these incremental loaders. So it's impossible to to find one of your contacts, one of your connections in LinkedIn through browsing or searching on the page. You can only do it by this really ridiculous kind of loading. So it makes a lot of sense for news or things that go on forever. It doesn't make any sense for any list where people may want to browse through the list or to search it in a different way. So in general, you need to have responses in less than a second for when you click on something. If it's longer than 10 seconds, people will figure things are broken. And so these are just, guidelines. They're general guidelines. You can certainly get much more specific numbers if you're an implementer and want to know your actual targets. It's also important to be predictable. So if you have a link that you know is going to be slow, like you have to go to a database, or you have to go, or it's going to result in a Flash file or something that's going to take a while, or you're going to generate some sort of content on the fly, then it's important to mark that so that people will know that this is a slow link or that it's going off somewhere different. And you also want to make sure everyone kind of expects if they go backwards and then forwards that that'll be really fast because the browser should have cached the pages. But some things people can do for their websites make it so caching is turned off. And so then going backwards is slow and going forwards is still slow. And so that's always annoying too. So it's much better if you can make sure that you don't require recalculating the pages if people are just going back and forth. And the other point is, if you have a lot of content on a page, there's a variety of ways to author a page so that it can load immediately, at least some things, and then the rest of it can come in later. So probably have never seen this, but it used to be that pictures were slow to download, and the way to make that work better is to tell the web page the size of the picture, and then it can do the rest of the page and leave a blank space for the picture, and then the picture will come in later. Sometimes you see this with websites where it's trying to turn off the pictures and so forth. Other things like tables and other things that you can use in HTML have different parameters. If you set them one way, then the table will load really quickly, and if you set them the other way, it'll load really slowly. And so obviously, that's something to take into account. What about the links? Obviously, a key part of navigation is having links. And pretty much everything in your page that somebody might want to click on should be a link. And there's lots of situations where website designers don't bother with this, which is really annoying, right? And so it says, see the warranty information. Everybody's going to want to click on that. But then if you don't make that clickable, then people have to go search for it, and that's really annoying. So everything that's a link should work. Nielsen recently had this article that talks about how broken links or things that aren't links that should be links actually erodes people's trust in your website and the credibility of your site as a whole and of your company even. And this is really hard, right? Because you always want to be refreshing your content and reorganizing things. And so it's really important to make sure that old links still work. And so Microsoft has done an amazing job of this. So a Pocket PC, it's probably something nobody's ever heard of. It was a big product in the 90s, right? It was their PDAs, and they decided, actually it was in the early 2000s, they renamed them all to be PC. Originally they called them Palm, but Palm got really annoyed at that. They called them Palm PCs, and they got sued. So they changed it to Pocket PC. And obviously, Microsoft has no products called Pocket PCs anymore. But if you click on that, then you get to Windows phones, right? And so what they've done is they've made sure that links, even if they're, in this case, maybe 15-year-old links, are still going to do something useful, right? They don't want to bring you to Pocket PC information because nobody has a Pocket PC anymore. But at least it brings you to someplace useful where you can find out about current versions of things. And so that's kind of the ultimate in making sure all your old links still work and that nothing ends up being giving you page not found or information has been deleted, or even worse, the information is still there, but I moved it, and now you have to go do the search to try and find it. What about the links themselves? At this point in the web, you don't have to say click here anymore, right? Everybody knows that links are something you click on. Links typically are highlighted either with a different color or with some kind of background, or even in the old-fashioned way of underlining them. And so it's much better to highlight the main words you want people to focus on. So it's really important for people to know that there's a schedule and homeworks, right? And so those are the words I make links, because then people know that they can click on them, right? And the clickable things are highlighted, right? In old-fashioned times before we had hyperlinks, you would underline things that are important or make bold things that are important. And so by using the links to show what's important, you're serving both purposes, right? Whereas if you underline click here, then the thing that people think is most important about your website is a whole bunch of clicks here's, right? Because you'll click here for this and click here for that and click here for this other thing. So it's much better to say what you're actually going to get to rather than instructions. And then, as I mentioned, making your URLs work. Sometimes people will do URL hacking. So if they're at some place, they might delete the end of the URL to see if that works. And the best design is to make it actually do something useful. So if you have a deep structure, like in Windows, I would hope that if I delete phones, that this would give me something in general about Windows, right? In English. And sure enough, that does work, right? And so, making it so that people can do this kind of hacking of your URLs is really useful, and it's really pretty easy, because it just means that at every level of your hierarchy, you need an index page, index.html page, that tells you about that particular category, right? And so just having a page that says you're not allowed to go to this page is just, again, kind of annoying. So there's a choice. It's pretty easy in your URLs, in your links to either open up a new page on top of the old page in the same browser window, open up a new tab, or open up a new window. And as a developer, you have some control over that. And generally, it's recommended that you don't open up new tabs, that you just open things in place. And typically, you would only open up new tabs when you're dramatically changing the context. So in Blackboard, it's recommended that we not open up documents in Blackboard, because then it gets confused. So most of the links to external papers and things in Blackboard do open up new windows. Another example is in the ACM digital search, or digital library search. All of the links will open up. If I click on any of the links, it will show stuff here. So if I click on Andy's link, so these are all overloading, except for the PDFs, which always form a new tab, right? And so it's a very straightforward, consistent rule that they've done throughout the website. So the disadvantage of new tabs, of course, is the back and forward doesn't work, and people might get confused about which tab they came from. Obviously I have a ridiculous number of tabs open here, and this one wasn't necessarily the last one that generated this new window, and so it can be tricky to understand where you've been. So that's one disadvantage. And one of the problems that the web helps solve is having too many windows open at the same time. And so that's one advantage of just using the back button and doing it in place. Another recommendation is that if you're advertising things, if you're putting URLs up on various places, if you're having links, if you're paying for advertising with Google or whatever, that the links that people click on should go to exactly what you were advertising about, right? And so if you're advertising a particular model of car, then when the people click on the link, they should go to information about that particular model, not, for example, to your main page and make them search for that information. Because then they're going to be annoyed, because the reason they clicked on your link is because they liked what you were talking about. And then, you have to make it so that that link actually goes there so that they can find out about it. You need to make sure your web pages are credible, that makes your company look good instead of bad. So nice, clean designs, good graphic design and color choice. Make sure the code and links work, right? And we kind of talked about that already. Have a privacy policy that people can find out about if you're collecting information about them. Have information where people can find out about your company. There are many, many companies that seem to want to hide where their headquarters are, which seems kind of mysterious. But that's something that people like to know. Are you based in Pittsburgh, or you're in New York or Silicon Valley? How can you provide feedback about products? How can you email the company? Things like that. The content of pages is really critical. So this quote basically says that writing on your web pages has to be done carefully. The words that drive the actions on the web page. And so it's important that every word on your pages is useful to people, that the navigation and the content all focuses on getting people to what they're trying to achieve. So there's a bunch of information about how that works. And there's a study that actually a different consultant, Jared Spool, did that showed that 40% of the usability obstacles in his study were as a result of words, content on the page not being understood. People, website designers picking the wrong words, picking confusing words, having sentences and paragraphs that don't make sense to people, and inaccuracies and missing information. So writing for the web actually requires specific talent, specific training, which is different than writing manuals, different than writing books or whatever. And so there are programs that will teach people how to do that in English departments, tech writing departments. Nowadays, people can be trained on how to write for the web, and it's definitely worth doing that. Obviously, it seems really obvious. You need to proofread your pages. It's kind of fun. Pick any misspelling of a word and type it into Google, and you're bound to find pages that misspell that word. This one is Guarantee. And I've been using this example for maybe 10 years, and they still haven't fixed this, which is kind of weird, because they've changed other things about the site. It's also misspelled, notice, in the URL. And that's actually really hard to find, because there's no spell checker on URLs, right? And so the fact that this URL is spelled wrong, you're going to have to really work hard to make sure that you don't do that kind of stuff. But this one here in the middle of the page is ridiculous, especially because if you scroll down, you can see that they actually do know how to spell it, right? So I don't know, it's just, so, what is it is a foreign website, but they went to all the trouble to give us an English version of it. What is your opinion of ZADs as a result of this, one typo, right? It already makes you think that this isn't a very serious company. So obviously, in addition to the content, you have to worry about the presentation of your text. So it has to be readable. And we talked about a bunch of metrics, learnability, efficiency for experts. And Nielsen proposes that readability should be a similar metric, although it's harder to say how to measure that objectively with numbers. But it's still really important. And then we talked a little bit before about scannability. So remember when we did the contextual inquiry of the CDW website, I was scanning all the headings and I got confused because the first word was misleading. So that's an example of people just skimming pages. So Nielsen says users scarcely read anything during an average website visit. And they've done eye tracking studies to prove this. Lots of other studies have confirmed that people just skim to try and find what they're specifically looking for. So you need to have your links be the most important words first. Same with titles. Use bulleted lists instead of paragraphs because they're much easier to scan. Make sure, again, that your links are highlighted because that way people can find them when they're skimming. And you never want to force people to go to another page to find out what that page is about, because then they're going to be annoyed when they have to go back because it was misleading, right? And so on the source page, the links should be named such that everyone knows what's going to be on that page when they get there. You need to, usually when people talk about readability, they're thinking about, one common metric is the grade that people have to be in order to understand the kind of words that you're using. So they talk about 6th grade reading level or college reading level, right? And so typically your tech writers and your engineers are all very highly educated people, but you typically want to aim your websites at people with less education who may only have a 6th grade reading ability or something like that. So it's kind of it's a little harder to measure, but you want to try and use plain language, avoid using metaphors, try to avoid using big words or specialist words and things like that. And we talked before about avoiding using humor and sarcasm and puns in your error messages, and generally they don't work very well on web pages anyway. And we're going to talk about international things later. Every page should have a title. It's pretty, in browsers now, you don't actually get to see the titles. Certainly you can't see much about these websites, but if you hover over them, then you get to see the title. And notice the titles that we've picked for our websites actually are pretty well done, that you put the main word first, right? If these all said Human-Computer Interaction Institute, Carnegie Mellon faculty, right, then every website would look identical. Every web page in our website would look identical when you only saw the first few letters. So you can see here that this says that Zia is our current page. If I click on this one, then it says FAC because it's the faculty page. So again, put the main word first in the title, the one that differentiates the different pages of your website. And that way, if only a little bit is showing, you'll know which page of the website it's on. That's that part. First word is important. Okay. To the extent that you have headlines, again, same rule applies. Put the important words first. Another thing about headlines is they're used by screen readers and also by search engines to understand the content better. So screen readers for blind people will skip from one header to the next. And so again, the headers have to be really meaningful. So rather than trying to use cute headers or headers that are engaging, unless you're a news site or an entertainment site, you really want to make sure that the headers provide useful information. Generally, you want to avoid articles in front of the headers because, again, it's just kind of extra words that people have to skim through. Legibility, there are lots of aspects that go into this that we talked about during the design lecture. Obviously, black text on a white background is the most easy to read. White text on black backgrounds is significantly harder to read, actually. You need good contrast. We talked about a lot of these before. There are a whole bunch of bad examples on the web. No one can probably read the blue text on a dark purple background. That was a really bad color choice. But this is just a guy. Surely no company would do that. But of course they do. So red text on a dark blue background is pretty much illegible. It's also, red and blue have a shimmery effect most of the time. So there's all sorts of good example. Whoops. Don't use all caps except for legal language. All caps and maybe a very short title. It turns out reading all caps is about 10% slower. And people think of all caps as shouting. So it's generally a bad approach for any block of text. Yeah.
I used to work in the writing center, and the thing a lot of people do is they'll use the full justify text place so that it fills the whole width, and that's actually a lot slower too, left and right is faster.
Right. So if you have uneven spacing in between your letters, or use hyphenated things so that you have a nice lined up text, unless you have ultra high resolution like paper, then it ends up being harder to read. So obviously I'm just giving a really tiny subset of all the different rules that one would learn when trying to do these. If you have an e-commerce site or whatever, you're going to have lots of fields. and there's lots of rules about fields. The one that really annoys me is when it requires that you put in numbers in a non-standard format, like without all the things. So it requires you to put in phone numbers with no spaces, or social security numbers, or credit card numbers. It's like the JavaScript to remove the spaces and hyphens is like one line. And so, just let people type in the number however they want, and then they're much more likely to do it correctly. And the reason that your credit card number is in little blocks of 4 is so that you can actually read it and remember it more correctly, and same with phone numbers. People have a much easier time remembering 4 numbers than 7 or 10 or 12. Type-in fields, nowadays everybody is pretty much required to use autocomplete if you have a type-in field, which is a little more programming. Pop-ups are more accurate, but tend to be slower for people and kind of annoying. But those are obvious choices for that. If you're doing a web page, where is the main icon going to be? Right? If it's an American or Western, it's going to be at the top left. If it's an Israeli or Arabic, it's going to be at the top right, because they read right to left, right? So everybody knows where the kind of main icon is. And where's the main navigation? It's horizontal or vertical right under that. Where's the search box? It's at the top right. If I need to change the foreign language, where is that? Usually in the top middle, right? And so there's some fairly standard conventions that people expect. And if you say, oh, I know, I'm going to be really cool and mess people up, right? Then it's just going to, impact your usability. And why would you want to do that? Nielsen argues that your home page is actually your most valuable real estate. Even, if you have a 50-story office building in downtown Tokyo, it's still not worth as much money as your homepage on the web, because that's where all of your business comes from. Homepage, there's a whole book that Nielsen has written about homepage design. Typically, you would have a larger logo. It should be really clear what your company does from your homepage. And there's lots of great examples. I'd like to pick on this one, where from the homepage, you have no idea what this company does. Basically, they have lots of pictures of people reading or enjoying their kids, and more than systems, we design happiness. They probably don't. The road to simpler and happier, right? And so, without doing an awful lot of clicking, you have no idea what this company sells or does. And so that's a bad thing. So the main thing to put on the home page is direct access to the main things that people want to do. And Delta Airlines is a good example. US Airways used to be a good example, but obviously US Airways is gone, and American Airlines is actually not a very good example, because most of the good stuff is too low. I guess you get to these pretty well, but you usually have to scroll up in order to do anything because of this giant picture, which isn't particularly useful. It's really important. The CDW search, remember, was awful. They actually fixed it at one point in 2008, and they had a 4.5 increase in sales and a 16% increase in success, right, as a result of fixing their search engine. So that had a direct and big impact on their bottom line. And searching, again, doesn't usually work. And finally, URLs. Pretty much people name their company these days based on what URLs they can buy, which is a good strategy, because if you name your company .net or dot something else that's not .com, you'll never be able to figure it out. And so you really want to try and get www.company.com name. And if you're a foreign language site, then you'll name it equivalently for the other countries. Okay, and then just for fun, this is a great website. Every year they have a new set of websites that are really poorly designed. Sometimes people take it to heart and actually fix them, but they have screenshots here. And if you find some really bad websites, send them to me and also to this website, and I'll use them next year. Okay, thanks. Sorry we ran over.